How many of you submit micron samples to a wool lab on your replacement sheep? Raise your hand high, I'm just curious. Okay, so some of us, about half of us, okay? When we submit that side sample or that little snippet, what they're analyzing at the lab is a mean fiber diameter, okay? So they're measuring 1,000 fibers on some pretty advanced optical technologies, and from those 1,000 fibers, they count what micron fibers are within the whole group, okay? That would be a mean fiber diameter. They then tell you how variable that group of fibers is. So in a group of fibers from a side sample, you're going to have stuff as fine as 12 micron. You're going to have stuff as coarse as 40 micron. And what they do is they generate this nice bell curve, and they cut it directly in half, and they say your mean fiber diameter is 25, okay? So realize that when you're evaluating visually, you are doing something that even the most advanced technology struggles to do, okay? Wool is inherently diverse, okay? You can pull from the shoulder and really skew your interpretation of what that fleece is on the fine side, or you can go all the way to the back, which would be the extreme coarse. But understanding that these two values will tell you where you're at from a very quantitative perspective is helpful. Another good one that's not as important for medium wools is the percentage of fibers greater than 30 micron, okay? Or the percentage of fibers less than 30 microns, sorry. So some of our really next to skin base layer applications that we take 19, 20 micron wool and turn it into, they will have a comfort factor of 99 to 96% of those fibers are less than 30 micron. Let's talk about uniformity, because this is taking it back to this week's event, okay? As we deal with uniformity, we need to understand that there is variation across that fleece. And chances are, if they're fitted, we're eliminating some of that variation, at least in length. We could probably still see it when it comes to micron, but a couple of things, and these are broad rules. I've seen some exceptions to the rule, especially when it comes to staple length. But generally speaking, as we move from the shoulder of the sheep back to the breech, we go from finer to coarser, okay? Before we had the ability to core individual fleeces, we would take a swatch of wool on the shoulder, we'd take a swatch of wool on the breech, and we'd see how much difference there was. And that difference would tell us how variable the fleece is. Less variability is better, but wool is inherently variable, and therefore, we're always going to see some of that. So don't be discouraged if you do see a 25 micron here on the shoulder and you do see a 28 micron on the hip. I think 3 micron is kind of the cutoff where, as a purist, where I'd like to see that variation. Doesn't mean we always get that lucky, absolutely not. Staple length, this one's critical. I think this is really important. We've got some great examples on these tables that you're going to evaluate. We should not see a tremendous amount of variation in the length of wool in the Columbia breed. I'm a big advocate that at the end of the year, when you are picking out your replacement ewe lambs, if they've all been managed in the same environment, those that have a shorter staple length, in theory, are those genetically programmed to grow less wool, okay? And so identifying those outliers, whether it be selling rams or ewes, it's critical to say if we all manage them in the same environment, what I'm seeing is the best evaluator of what their genetic potential is. And so I have the privilege of going up to the Bighorn Mountains and sorting through 300 or 400 replacement ewe lambs every fall. And all I'm doing is I'm parting the wool on the breech, I'm parting the wool up on the shoulder, and those that have a lot of difference in their crimp design or their handle, we mark them and they'll be productive ewes, but they're not improving their wool clip if we were to keep them in. So remove those outliers when you can. Last but not least, density, okay? I think this is something that as I got to ultrasound some of these rams and some of these ewes in the production class, it was really cool to see the density in the Columbia breed. It's been a couple years since I've done this amount, okay, with this diversity, and I think that's a major area of marketability for the Columbia breed. A dense fleece allows those animals to thermoregulate better, right? More openings in a loose fleece, they're committing more calories to try and stay warm. I think there's some real advantages of talking about density. But similarly, we see the most density up here on the neck, and we start to see that density diminish, or the number of follicles, if we had a microscope, diminish as we go to the bridge. So what does this mean from an evaluation standpoint? This right here probably would be the most applicable piece of information that I have to share today. Okay, I hope you're in love with all this other stuff, but this is what you're working on. You're going to be going through the pens and selecting your next stud ram, your next replacement use. You're going to be networking. These kind of questions and these kind of evaluations are evaluations of substance, I think, when it comes to wool. Belly wool. This has gotten me in more trouble. I should just leave belly wool alone, okay? Because belly wool is one of those things like talking about the weather last year, this year, right? Well, it was pretty dry last year. It's much greener this year. You know, it's kind of an opinion, all right? But the thing about belly wool is you can see it in certain breeds. It's a little bit harder to see in the Columbia breed, I think, just because those sheep that are programmed to produce this type of fiber are those usually in the finer programmed microns. But basically how we define belly wool, and I'm going to, since I'm on camera, I'm going to look at the camera and I'm going to say, here's the new definition of belly wool according to Witt, okay? I'll be pretentious. So belly wool is best defined by saying, is there a change in length? Is there a change in density? From where the belly wool is up to the side. And I know this example is hard for you to see right here, but hopefully you can all tell that there's a lot more, obviously given its location, it's a lot dirtier, it's a little bit more compressed looking, but more importantly, the change in length is what really can't lie when you're looking at belly wool, especially in some of these medium and coarser breeds, is that if you're changing 1.5 inches from the midline of the belly up to the top, chances are that's belly wool or off character wool or whatever you want to call it. But when we shear that fleece where 1/3 of it is belly wool, do you think it's going to weigh up to one that doesn't have belly wool? Absolutely not. And so I have in the past only characterized this belly wool as based off the crimp design, and that's not the best way to do it. We've been doing some genomics work on a ram test to help us inform a little bit some of our selection and try and marry some of the performance testing with genomics work. And what we've determined is those sheep that have a high degree of belly wool are expressing gene pathways that are improper keratinization of wool. All of us have keratinized fiber on our body, our hair, our fingernails. Basically, it's the final process of turning these tissues into hair or fingernails, okay? This basically, in the process of the follicle where it was forming to become a fiber, it had a malfunction of some sort, and that's what we refer to as belly wool. Okay? That's a terrible technical definition, but essentially it's improper finishing of that protein structure in that fiber. Okay? But let's back to the pragmatics. Why does that matter and how can you use it as you evaluate some of these breeds? Belly wool. Okay? Generally speaking, we assign a belly wool score on ram test. It's relative to this kind of diagram. Obviously, as you could imagine, we'd want to see belly wool in that A range, down in the belly, as the name would insinuate. Okay? B, it starts creeping up a little bit. When we start to see that short compressed fiber or that change in crimp design from here to here, chances are that's getting a little bit too high up. Now what I've observed is sometimes the belly wool doesn't show this wave pattern. Sometimes I see it in the flank and up here on the shoulder, kind of as like a wave. Regardless of where you're seeing it, establish those norms in your flock and say, is this what I want to do to improve my wool clip? Now, if you've got an excellent maternal ewe who consistently weighs more pounds of lamb, she's a powerhouse in every trait, are you going to sell her if she has a little bit of belly wool on her shoulder? I hope not, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that single trait selection without taking into account those other economically important traits is probably not the best strategy. And I'm going to point to the camera and say that again. Single trait selection and discriminating on single traits never gets you anywhere. And lastly, I guess I'll point out here some of this area. I know that we don't always have a perfect frontal view of our sheep, but generally speaking, talking about that change in length that we see in belly wool, I'd like to see a nice long staple clear down to the lower where you start to meet the belly, okay? That change in staple doesn't lie. Sometimes you can get thrown off by how that crimp design looks by calling it belly wool, but staple length will never lie. I get to thank a Columbia breeder that I got to work with in Montana. Mary Langhouse gave me this. It was like a 1980s wool grower magazine, okay? And I love these gems because over time, as our industry has contracted or changed, some of these real practical pieces of information I just don't come across like I would like to see. And so make sure you tell Mary I said hello. This variation in grade, basically, it shows us a little bit like what I referred to earlier. This one would be an example of what we would consider acceptable variation. So right here, we're working in wool grades. You have a 60s, okay, which is around a 23, 24 micron. You move down to the belly, it stays at a 60s, but then you go to the breech and it's a 58s, and down to a 56. That's acceptable. That's the amount of variation we'd see. Now, acceptable for this may not be acceptable for you. I'm going to pick on you, Raina, just because I can. Maybe you'd want to see that a 58s instead of a 56s, okay? But the point is when you evaluate those areas, you are being brutally honest about how variable that fleece is. And that's a good thing. Brutally honest is good. So the next thing we're going to talk about is medullated fiber. Those are those hollow hair fibers that we all struggle with in some areas. And that actually does go back to a specific area in the animal. So the reason I'm talking about medullation or hair fibers, okay, is that those are hollow wool fibers, okay? Continuously hollow, and when we process those and dye those, not only are they less strong, they become brittle because they have that higher hollow area in the medulla, but they also, interestingly, they also don't take up dye the same way. And so medullated fibers and the proportion of medullated fibers in a lot of wool really is important to discriminate against. And so what we see, again, this shows a little bit of some of these medullated fiber types at a very close cross-section. Generally speaking, medullation is more of an issue in medium to finer wool breeds. I'm sorry, medullation is an issue in those breeds that are a little bit coarser. And I'll talk about some of that area in a minute. But again, the fact that this area becomes hollow, the processes of that fiber turning into a wool fiber was incomplete. It didn't keratinize like it was supposed to, similar to the belly wool example. So there's a couple of areas that I know you all have seen a lot of this medullated fiber or this kemp. There's some examples of some fleeces on the table that you'll be able to look at. But again, because it is larger fiber, it stands out like a sore thumb, okay? The other way to discriminate whether you're dealing with a medullated fiber is you saw on the locks of wool, if you look at your cheat sheet, pretty much everything has some kind of crimp design, okay? Medullated fiber is kind of like going to the crazy house with crimp design. It's one nice curvature here and then it kinks another way. It looks just like a crazy hair, okay? Like my eyebrows as I've gotten older, okay? Hair is slightly different than kemp. Generally speaking, kemp is shorter. It's restricted to the cheeks and the legs. It usually will fall out in the combing and carding process, whereas the long hollow fiber, that gets bound up in a nice sliver of top or in a yarn. And so it's really important to make sure that if we see an animal with a lot of this in it, that we probably take a second guess at whether we're going to use it as a breeding stock. What's really interesting, and I hope everyone will go do this, I'm sure you all have weaned lambs at home that you didn't bring here, right? Does everybody have some of those? Well, my boys are raising some bum lambs because I don't play in the market lamb game. Just call me a sheep specialist purist, but we're showing some breeding ewes that we raised as bums. And interestingly, if you look around the pole, that is the first place in utero where you would see those type of fibers develop. So up on the pole, or what we would consider our top knot, is where you're going to see those prototypical medullated hair fibers, okay? What you shouldn't see is you shouldn't see those on the back of the sheep, okay? I think as a rule of thumb, if we're selling breeding stock, we should have some good discrimination against those medullated fiber types. You all have seen it, halo hair. We call it halo hair. Sometimes that will disappear after the first shearing. So I would encourage you to give at least one shearing before you make the call. But we all see it, and we see it down in the flank and up underneath the armpit as well. Medullated fibers are bad, and you're going to get a chance to see some of those.